I never thought a routine Thursday evening could turn into a full-blown neighborhood nightmare. But that's exactly what happened the moment HOA. Karen strutted onto our street, clipboard in hand, eyes glaring like a drill sergeant. She was on a mission, and anyone standing in her way was about to get a front row seat to her brand of control. What started as a normal, quiet neighborhood quickly spiraled into chaos the second she announced her mandatory meeting at the community clubhouse. At first, residents shrugged it off. We'd all heard about Karen before. The tales of her relentless inspections, petty fines, and unsolicited lectures, but most of us had managed to avoid direct conflict. Not tonight. Tonight, she was coming for everyone. Flyers had been shoved under every door. The words "mandatory attendance" stamped in bold, unmissable letters, as if it were some government decree rather than a self-appointed HOA rule. I watched from my porch as cars reluctantly pulled into the small parking lot, neighbors exchanging anxious glances. Some tried to sneak by, hoping she wouldn't notice. Others marched in, resigned to endure whatever lecture she had prepared. And then she arrived in her black SUV, outstretched arm pointing at anyone who dared linger on their driveway. "You will be there," she barked, her voice echoing down the cul-de-sac. There was no hint of a suggestion. This was an order. By the time we entered the clubhouse, the tension was palpable. Chairs scraped across the floor as people took their seats, avoiding eye contact with Karen, who had already taken her place at the head of the room like a general about to issue her battle plan. Her clipboard rattled as she began reading a list of violations no one had heard of. Trash cans left out too long, lawn decorations deemed inappropriate, even complaints about how someone's dog barked last week. Then, just as murmurs of frustration began to rise, Karen slammed her fist on the table. "Everyone must stay until I say otherwise," she declared. At that moment, a neighbor muttered under his breath, "This is insane." That mutter quickly turned into a collective groan as Karen's voice boomed louder. Insisting attendance was non-negotiable, and threatening penalties if anyone tried to leave. The room grew chaotic. Whispers turned to arguments, and a few brave souls stood up, demanding to know what legal authority she actually had. That's when it happened. Someone dialed 911. Within minutes, uniformed officers arrived, their presence adding a surreal layer to what was supposed to be a simple HOA meeting. The clash between self-appointed authority and real law enforcement had begun, and I realized we were no longer just neighbors in mild conflict. We were participants in a showdown that could explode at any moment. The officers entered cautiously, scanning the room as if walking into a live wire. Karen, unfazed, pointed at them like they were trespassers in her kingdom. "This is a private meeting. You have no right to interfere," she shouted, her voice cracking with both authority and panic. But the cops didn't flinch. One of them, a tall woman with a no-nonsense expression, calmly asked everyone to remain seated while she assessed the situation. It was almost comical. Karen, clipboard trembling in her hands, trying to assert control in front of real law enforcement. She barked orders at residents to sit still, to listen, to follow her rules, as if the mere presence of the police would somehow vanish her existence. But the officers were professionals. They knew her type, the self-appointed enforcer of rules that only existed in her imagination. People started talking quietly among themselves, realizing that Karen's power had limits. Some neighbors whispered about past fines and letters they'd received, while others openly rolled their eyes at her audacity. One man, Mr. Thompson, from 2 houses down, finally spoke up. "Does anyone actually have the authority to make this mandatory?" he asked, voice shaking but firm. Karen's eyes narrowed, and she snapped, "You'll pay fines if you leave!" The officers intervened immediately. They reminded everyone that HOA rules could not override legal rights, and no one could be forced to attend a meeting under threat of penalties that weren't legally enforceable. Karen's protests grew louder, almost desperate, as the room collectively started to realize how fragile her authority really was. She demanded to see identification, shouted that the officers were biased, and accused neighbors of conspiring against her. The officers maintained their calm, asking her to step aside so the meeting could either continue voluntarily or end peacefully. By this point, the tension had reached a fever pitch. Chairs were moved, people fidgeted nervously, and Karen's voice oscillated between rage and panic. It was like watching a soap opera unfold in real life. The officers tried to mediate, suggesting a compromise. Anyone who wanted to leave could do so immediately without penalty, and those who wished to stay could continue on a voluntary basis. Karen refused, insisting she had rules everyone had to follow. But her grip was slipping, and the room sensed it. I stood near the back, recording the chaos on my phone. The energy was electric. Neighbors who had once avoided confrontation were now emboldened by the officers' presence. Karen's insistence on absolute control collided headfirst with reality, and the room became a battlefield of wills. By the time one officer warned that continued obstruction could lead to citations, a collective sense of relief swept through the crowd. People began realizing Karen wasn't invincible. It was clear this mandatory meeting was unraveling in real time, and the showdown between HOA Karen, the residents, and the law had only just begun. But no one knew how far she would go when cornered. The air in the clubhouse was thick with unease. Karen's eyes darted around, glaring at anyone daring to defy her, while the officers maintained their steady presence at the front of the room. For a moment, it seemed like the chaos might settle, but Karen had one last card to play. She slammed her clipboard on the table, papers scattering like confetti, and announced, "If anyone leaves now, I will report them for contempt of HOA rules." Her voice echoed, shrill and unrelenting, a desperate attempt to regain control. The neighbors, however, were no longer intimidated. A wave of murmurs swept through the room as people began questioning her authority out loud. "Contempt of HOA rules?" One woman scoffed, shaking her head. "That's not even a real thing." Another neighbor, who had been quietly recording the entire meeting, raised his phone and said, "You're making threats that don't hold any legal weight." "The cops are here, Karen. Maybe you should calm down." Karen's face turned red, and her hands trembled. It was the first time anyone had challenged her with such force. She began pacing, muttering about bylaws and violations, trying to justify her so-called authority. The officers exchanged subtle glances, clearly used to these types of confrontations. One officer spoke quietly to Karen, explaining that she could not legally force anyone to stay against their will, and any attempt to intimidate residents could be considered harassment. Panic flashed across her eyes. She snapped at the officers, insisting they were siding with the residents. But the calm, measured response only made her more frantic. The neighbors sensed the shift immediately. Karen was losing control. A few brave souls started packing their things, standing and calmly walking toward the exit. Each step Karen tried to block, only to be gently redirected by the officers, further undermining her authority. Then it happened. Karen's voice cracked, and she yelled at one resident to sit down or face consequences. The resident, unfazed, stopped, looked directly at her and said, "You can't do that. This is harassment, Karen." Gasps echoed through the room. Others joined in, firmly stating they would not be bullied. The officers nodded, documenting the confrontation, while Karen's face morphed from fury to disbelief. It was a turning point. The room that had been tense with fear moments before now pulsed with defiance. The residents had realized they had rights, and Karen's mandatory meeting had collapsed under the weight of reality. Papers lay scattered on the floor, her clipboard abandoned, and the aura of control she had cultivated was gone. As the crowd started to disperse, Karen attempted one final outburst, but her voice barely carried over the chatter of residents leaving. The police remained, offering reassurance and ensuring no further escalation occurred. It was clear this evening would be remembered. Not for Karen's authority, but for the moment the neighborhood collectively stood up to her. The tension in the clubhouse had finally begun to dissipate, but Karen wasn't ready to accept defeat. She stood near the door, arms crossed, muttering under her breath about bylaws, fines, and people with no respect for rules. Her usual air of authority had crumbled, replaced by something almost pitiful. Frustration, desperation, and disbelief. The neighbors, now emboldened, were no longer intimidated. Conversations buzzed with a mixture of relief and quiet triumph, and a few exchanged wry smiles, recognizing that Karen's reign of fear had just taken a massive hit. The officers lingered, making sure everyone left safely. While subtly documenting Karen's behavior, one officer whispered to a neighbor that her threats and refusal to comply could be used in future complaints if she tried similar stunts again. It was the first time I'd seen Karen hesitate, her usual certainty replaced by caution. For a self-proclaimed enforcer, she suddenly looked small, exposed, and powerless. As neighbors filtered out of the clubhouse, some shared stories of previous encounters with Karen. Absurd. Fines for minor infractions, unsolicited inspections of lawns and decorations, and even confrontations at front doors. The collective realization was clear. She had long overstepped the boundaries of her position, and tonight had exposed the truth. A sense of justice lingered in the air, subtle but powerful, like a weight lifting after years of silent tension. Karen, realizing she no longer commanded attention, attempted a weak final plea. "This isn't over," she shouted, her voice cracking. The response was a chorus of laughter and sarcastic cheers. Residents left with their heads high, documenting her meltdown on phones and social media, sharing the story so everyone in the community could see the absurdity firsthand. Her threats now held no power. Tonight's events had turned her own tactics against her. Outside, the night air felt liberating. Conversations continued in the street as neighbors recounted the chaos, chuckling at Karen's frantic gestures and proclamations. The sense of unity was palpable. For once, the neighborhood felt like a community, not a place dominated by a single overbearing personality. The officers quietly departed, leaving behind a scene of both relief and quiet celebration. By the time Karen finally left, she was no longer the imposing figure who had marched down our street hours earlier. She drove away in her black SUV, head down, muttering about next time and bylaws, but no one paid attention. The evening had ended with a clear message. Control through fear was temporary, but community and courage were lasting. And as neighbors returned to their homes, the memory of her collapse would linger. A reminder that even the most confident HOA Karen could be held accountable when people refused to be intimidated. The neighborhood had survived her mandatory meeting, and in doing so, had reclaimed their peace, their rights, and their sense of dignity. If you enjoyed watching how our neighborhood stood up to HOA Karen, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more crazy, real-life stories. Comment below and let us know. Have you ever dealt with a Karen like this? And don't forget to like the video if you loved seeing her meltdown.